All right, with that in mind, let's move on to the New York Knicks, who is, of course, your favorite team. I think the place we got to start just based off their offseason would be the coaching change. I think that's probably the biggest story. What did you make of getting rid of Tom Thibodeau after he led them to their first Eastern Conference Finals in 25 years? And then what did you make of the Mike Brown hiring?
It was tough. I loved Thibodeau. I mean, I really did. He, brought the team to heights they hadn't seen in a quarter century. I understand the concerns with overplaying guys, fine, but look at how many teams were injured in the playoffs. Who was injured on the Knicks? I get Mitchell Robinson was hurt to start the year, but that really didn't have anything to do with minutes. Jalen Brunson hurt his ankle, missed a month. That had nothing to do with minutes. So Mikal Bridges never misses a game. OG Anunoby, he had an injury history prior to the Knicks, and last season mainly stayed healthy, missed some games. But yeah, so, I thought that was a little bit overstated. I also don't think, I see people say that, you know, he needed to develop the bench. Well, if you don't have guys on the bench, who are you developing? You can't just, take random guys and say, you guys need to play to get better. Not that these guys are bums or anything, but, there's a reason that DeLon Wright, Campaign, Precious Achua are still unsigned. Landry Shamet, I wouldn't mind him back on the Knicks, but he's also unsigned. So, these guys that Knicks fans wanted him to play more, they're still unsigned, and there's got to be a reason for it. They're not unsigned just because Thibodeau wasn't playing them huge minutes. But, Mike Brown, I think we saw in that 2022 season how well the Kings offense did that year. And that brings me excitement. I think he could bring new elements to the offense that maybe we didn't see under Thibodeau. I've read things about how he wants the players to basically react within a second, decide what they're going to do, not hold the ball, play with a quicker pace. And I think those things are important. And, if that is the case, then those guys are probably going to have to play a little less minutes. And, I'm really interested in seeing what Brown does if he changes up that starting lineup, because on paper, it looked like a top 4, top 5 starting lineup in the NBA, but then you see the net ratings and it didn't add up. Mitchell Robinson's really been my favorite Knick since a rookie when he was rocking 26. Of course, he's been 23 now. I personally would start him. I don't know if that was a topic you were going to bring up, so we could talk about that more later. But overall, I'm excited, but skeptical at the same time. I mean, I understand those Cavs teams didn't have great players alongside LeBron James, but, he coached LeBron James and didn't coach him to a championship. How much credit should he be getting for, leading them to the finals and things like that? He definitely does deserve credit for that 2022 season without question, but they lost in the first round. They really struggled to begin last season, and they improved after he left with Doug Christie, although they kind of reverted back to struggling after Christie's first 20-25 games. So, yeah, I'm excited, but I'm not completely sold that it was the right decision.
Yeah, I think you really nailed it there. First, to your point about the bench, I definitely agree. You can criticize Thibodeau a little bit for not using the bench, and I think that has been a problem sort of throughout his career, but at the same time, with this roster he had last year, I don't really see who he was going to go to that would have made that much of a difference, like you said. We can talk about the free agent pickups in a second because I think that will make a difference. Even if they had kept Thibodeau around, I think he would have played some of these guys more because they're NBA rotational level players. I think that's going to make a massive difference for this Knicks team, who we did see struggle depth wise. And then, sort of like you said with Brown, I think it will be helpful to diversify the offense a little bit. Like you were talking about, making quicker reads. I thought that was a big problem in the Pacers series, and then, I mean, not so much in the Celtics series. They kind of dominated Boston a little bit, but going back to the Pistons series a little bit too, I did think that was a little bit of a problem. I personally think they could use a little bit more of that Brunson Cat two-man game. I felt like Cat didn't get enough touches, quite frankly. And I think they could really sort of move a little bit away from that heliocentric style of offense, even though they did statistically have one of the better offenses. I think there's just another level this group can reach when you look at the offense, how talented of offensive players both Brunson and Towns are, and just utilizing them together a little bit more. And then Bridges and OG also getting them the proper touches. I think they could benefit from that style a little bit more. But in general, I do think it's also interesting how Mike Brown is a little bit more of that old school coach like Thibodeau. A little bit more of a creative offensive mind, which I think will benefit the Knicks, but still that same old school style of coach in many ways. But yeah, what do you think about diversifying the offense a little bit more? Do you want to see Cat or maybe an OG or Mikel a little bit more involved? And do you think that was a problem last year?
I mean, I could see, maybe needing to get the ball out of Brunson's hand a little bit more than he had it. I can't bash Brunson at all. He's the main reason that we've become one of the top teams in the league. But yeah, there are times where he pounds the ball into the floor, and the Knicks don't really get into a set offense with till there's 7-8 seconds left on the shot clock. Yeah, so I need to get away from having Brunson waste the clock down to 6-7 seconds. Can't rely on him to score all the time. I mean, we saw so many times where he came through in the clutch, hitting shot after shot. But just that pick and roll offense we thought would be completely dominant with Towns and Brunson. We just didn't see enough of it, and I think we should see more of it in the upcoming season. We also saw OG really step up while Brunson was out with his ankle injury, scoring, having 25, 30-point games. And then, there's just games where he's completely invisible with Brunson, and that's not really all on Brunson. It's also partially on him. And Bridges, he's awesome in that mid-range. That's, just his go-to shot. You would like to see him take it to the hole a little more. He does seem to shy away from contact. I mean, people have jokes. That's why he hasn't missed a game. He's shying away from contact. We've seen him go, games without even attempting a free throw attempt. But yeah, I mean, there's having that Jordan Clarkson piece will be huge because Deuce McBride, very good scorer off the bench, but Clarkson almost reminds me of Jamal Crawford, Lou Williams in that sense where are they the most efficient scorers? No. But, sometimes you just need that guy to score off the bench that can get hot, like a Crawford, like a Lou Williams did. And I think that's something that Clarkson will bring to the Knicks that they just haven't had in a few years. So I do think that they should take strides on the offensive end, even if they do make a switch to Mitchell Robinson in the starting lineup, who, as you know, isn't going to score a lot. But, I think Mike Brown can diversify the offense enough where it looks better. I mean, their offensive rating was 6th, 7th in the league, but that really dropped after the All-Star break. So, improvements still need to be had if they want to be a title contender.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even some of my own criticism about not using Cat enough, I think partially that's on him. Sort of saw in that Piston series, Tobias Harris was guarding him and he wasn't taking advantage of it enough. Even though he wasn't getting a ton of touches, I think he could have just used his force and size a little bit more in that series. But yeah, at the same time, talent-wise, and especially with potentially a little bit more flair to that offense, this is one of the better and more complete teams in the league. You look at what they have: best center offensive players in Towns, and then one of the best perimeter players in Brunson, and then two really high quality wins in OG and Mikel. So I think this team's really set up nicely. And then your point about the free agent pickups and sort of like we discussed earlier about not using the bench is just sort of a natural transition to what they did in the offseason. I know we sort of discussed it a little bit, but Jordan Clarkson and then Gershon Yabusele, what do you think of those pickups, and what do you think they're really going to bring to this team?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about Clarkson, and I just think having that bench piece that can score 10 to 15 a night is huge. McBride did it in spurts, but there'd be games where he'd only get 2, 4, 6. And yeah, Yabusele, a guy who really showed that he could hit the three ball. Admittedly, I hadn't seen much of him in Boston. Well, you're a Boston fan. You didn't see much of him in Boston because he really didn't play much. So I wasn't fully knowing what to expect him his first year back in the NBA with Philly. I mean, yes, I saw him in the Olympics, but that's a small sample size. I wasn't going to take that to believe that he was all of a sudden going to make this huge jump in his return to the NBA. But he definitely did so. I mean, 38% from three, double digit score. Kind of similar to a Precious Achua size wise, where they'd both be undersized centers. But I think Yabusele is the more capable offensive player compared to Achua, especially because Achua, other than occasional corner threes, wasn't taking that outside shot. Yabusele definitely proved that he could hit with Philadelphia last season. So I think that was a huge get, two huge gets for the Knicks. Like you mentioned, these would be guys that Tibbs would be playing. So it would have been interesting to see him with this roster, but obviously that's something we won't see. And yeah, it just gives them more reliable guys because you have them two, then you're going to play McBride, and then you're going to play whoever doesn't start between Mitchell Robinson and Josh Hart. So that gives you a solid 9-man rotation, which we know the Knicks weren't going to in the playoffs. And that's a 9-man rotation you could keep in the playoffs. None of those guys are guys that you would cut from a playoff rotation. And, it'll be interesting to see how they fill this last roster spot. There's been talk about Ben Simmons, not into it, especially when you got Mitchell Robinson or to a lesser extent Josh Hart that defenses don't necessarily respect to shoot the ball. Now you're going to add a third guy like that. So I'm not for it. But yeah, that's why I'm more for Shamet, who's been a rumored guy to come back. But yeah, just a lot more depth on this team. Knock on wood that they could stay pretty fairly healthy, just like they did last year. Those kind of like Minnesota, because after that first 9 or 10, you got the guys you drafted last year, Paco Daddier, McCullough Jr., Tyler Kolek. I know he's got his almost like cult following of Knicks fans, but I don't think he's a rotational guy, at least at the moment. So yeah, I think both of these teams we're talking about today might have more depth than they did last year, but injuries would really hurt them because after the top 10, there just isn't much there. And that was a problem with the Knicks last year too. So it's lucky that they did stay healthy. But yeah, two quality guys who could also step into the starting lineup. Was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago where Clarkson was a full-time starter with the Jazz? So yeah, he's a little bit older in age, but he's a guy who could get hot at any time, and especially in a playoff setting, that could be huge. Where the Knicks starters might, and we saw how many slow starts they had in the playoffs, but they're down 20-12, and he comes in, scores 8 points in 2 minutes, and they're back in the game. That's a huge guy to have coming off your bench.
Yeah, most definitely. I feel like both of these acquisitions were huge for the Knicks team this summer, and especially getting them at the prices that they did. Both players, I believe, were on minimum deals or close to that. I think Gershon was a little bit above the minimum.
Slightly less than the taxpayer mid-level.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, but I mean, really great value deals in my opinion for both of those guys. Clarkson, I think, is going to sort of draw the headlines just because he's a more well-known player, and I do think the scoring presence that he's going to provide is definitely vital. But I look at Gershon as the better signing. I think he's going to have a really strong impact for this team. Especially he gives you that sort of Mitchell Robinson insurance in case he gets injured. Like you said, he's a little bit of a better version of Precious, especially on offense. I think Gershon's just so versatile on offense. He can space the floor, as you mentioned, but then he can also really attack mismatches, and he's very capable as an inside scorer as well, where Precious, at least from what I saw, he was more of just like a hustle guy, and he scores off that. He provides some energy, but I think Gershon just does that to a whole nother level, and he's just a lot more complete. And I think you have some really nice lineup options there. You can play him alongside Towns. You could do a lineup with him and Mitchell Robinson. I think that could be really nice for this team. I think we could see him guarding centers at times. Not necessarily the best defender in the world, but just with his size, he does have that versatility on defense as well. So I think that was just an absolute home run move. And I definitely have to agree about the Ben Simmons point. I've been a little bit confused why them and even the Celtics have been connected to Simmons. I don't see either team as the best fit for him personally. But yeah, especially the Knicks, especially after you go out and sign Gershon, I don't think that makes as much sense. Why not just bring a guy back in Shamet who was able to provide some solid minutes in the playoffs and is a really solid 3-point shooter? I think that would make just a little bit more sense to me. But yeah, we'll see. I don't think signing Ben Simmons is necessarily going to break this team just because of how complete of a roster they are. But I think that's something to note. We can get into the starting lineup a little bit as we've hinted at it. Do you think it's I know you sort of mentioned you would lean to starting Mitch Robinson, but do you think that's necessary to get the most out of this team and really get the most out of Cat?
I mean, the reason I would do it, and I love Josh Hart, and I still think he would get probably 30 minutes per game coming off the bench. So it's not a huge demotion of any sort. I just see it as the Knicks having two guys who clearly aren't defensive minded players. And I don't know if that's the right word to use for Brunson because it's not like he doesn't give an effort. He does. I mean, he was either second or third in charges taken, charges drawn. So, he's giving an effort, but obviously he's undersized. And Karl Anthony Towns, I think he set the NBA record for most times being referenced for, going under the screen on a three-pointer. Stan Van Gundy must have said it about 50 times in one of those Pacers games. And, Stan Van Gundy was about to leave the announcer's box to talk to Cat about it. That's how frustrated he was getting about it. So, having Brunson and Towns in that starting lineup, just again, two guys who, and it helps having OG and Bridges, but it also puts more on the table for them to do, which is why I think Bridges was a bit overstretched. Knicks fans saw that guy that once was runner-up for Defensive Player of the Year while with Phoenix. And for, the first 40, 50 games, while he wasn't a bad defender, he clearly wasn't on that level. And, he was, the guy guarding the ball handler much of the time, which wasn't necessarily his role in Phoenix. Was to a certain extent, but not the level it was with the Knicks. So yeah, he was just given too much of that duty. I think OG could take more of that role as well to take a little bit off of Bridges' plate in doing that. And that may have affected him on the offensive end as well. Maybe that's why because he's never been a huge free throw guy, but he wasn't going 15 games without one like he did last season. He did seem to shy away from contact at times, and he is, a skinnier player, absolutely. But yeah, I think that having Robinson out there on defense makes both of their lives a little bit easier because, no one's a perfect defender. They get by you, whoever they're guarding. You have Robinson under there. Karl Anthony Towns, not the rim defender that Robinson is, and he's a foul magnet. And that might also help Towns not get in foul trouble so much because he was the guy down low, and instead of being that shot blocking presence, he was that hacking presence. Frequently complaining. Then you'd see the replay, and it's like, all right, come on, Karl, you clearly used your hip to affect his shot or things like that. So I think that might help with him not getting in such frequent foul trouble, which it was crazy how often it happened last year. So that's the main reasons I would go for it. And, I also hear, Mitchell Robinson makes it a 5-on-4 on offense, but that isn't true because offensive rebounding is offense. And, either him or Steven Adams, probably the best offensive rebounder in the game. That presence, being able to give your team so many second, third opportunities is huge. And, that does make him an offensive presence. And we've seen seasons where he's averaged close to double digits in scoring. We'll say maybe Mike Brown can unlock a little bit more for him because he definitely is a lob threat. I mean, DeAndre Jordan, he was a lob threat. That's really all he was. But I'm not saying Jalen Brunson's Chris Paul, but, we saw Jordan have seasons where he averaged, I don't know, 14, 15 a night. So, Robinson could average 10 to 12, I think. So, yeah, I would definitely start with that. Obviously could be subject to change, but I think that would help Cat out big time, and also the wing duo of OG and Mikal Bridges.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely tend to agree with you there. Even dating back to Towns' time in Minnesota, we just saw how valuable it was for him to play alongside a real rim protector, especially in Gobert. I mean, we saw Gobert win the Defensive Player of the Year while he's playing next to Towns, and then we did see Towns play some of the best defense of his career that season, especially his last year in Minnesota. But I do think that could have a similar impact to him playing next to Robinson. Obviously, Robinson isn't as elite of a defender as Gobert, but he has a similar skill set in the sense that he's just a really good rim protector. And I think it just, like you said, it makes life easier for everyone. But then thinking about Towns specifically, him guarding forwards is a lot better than him being your sole rim protector. It makes him a lot less easy to target. Not saying that you can't target him at all when he's on a forward, but it makes him a lot harder to target compared to when he's just protecting the rim, and you can really draw him into significant actions as we saw in the playoffs, especially against the Pacers there. But yeah, I mean, I think it would really benefit him. And then I agree with your point about Robinson's offense. He is a very solid lob threat, offensive rebounder. And I don't think he's a complete zero like everyone thinks he is. I mean, you look at the free throw shooting, obviously not great, but at the same time, he does provide some value there, crashing the glass, catching lobs, setting screens, etc. And I think it's better to have your one non-floor spacing guy be that sort of lob threat center compared to starting a Josh Hart who really can't shoot and had a very poor shooting season. Having him on the wing is a little bit more challenging because one guy can completely sag off of him, and then that makes it harder for Brunson or Bridges or OG or whoever, but I mean mainly Brunson. But yeah, at the same time, I just think having your center be able to be that non-floor spacer, I think, is more ideal than a guy like Josh Hart. And then I think it also opens up opportunities for Towns as a three-point shooter, which we've seen him really excel at. He'll play on the perimeter a lot more. I mean, he already was playing on the perimeter a good amount, but next to Robinson, it will allow him to really maximize his abilities as a floor spacer. So I think that aspect of it is also key for this Knicks team. So yeah, I would definitely look for them to start Robinson and Towns together. I think it would be very beneficial, and we saw it in the playoffs when they made that lineup change in the Pacer series. That's when they looked the best. That's when they won the games that they did in that series, and I think we're going to have to see that continue for this Knicks team to reach their ceiling, and I think it's likely to under Mike Brown.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Mitchell gets hurt. Unfortunately, things will have to change. They probably, would they go? I mean, you kind of would have to put Towns back at center and I guess bring Josh Hart back in the lineup. Maybe you can make a case that you play Yabusele, start him. So I just, it's so key for Mitchell Robinson to stay healthy this year. And, I'm not saying play all 82 games, but let's just say it's important for him to stay healthy when it matters.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. I feel like he's definitely one of their X factors when you look at this Knicks team and their championship hopes. Another guy I want to talk about, we've mentioned him a little bit, but Mikal Bridges, I thought his first season was a little bit divisive among Knicks fans, especially given how much they gave up to get him in the offseason. But at the same time, I think he had some really solid moments, and I think he's a very important part of this team. So overall, what did you make of his season last year? And what did you make of the recent contract that he got? I know there's a little bit of controversy there as well, but I think it's a pretty good deal, especially in the modern NBA, and considering how much they gave up to trade for him last offseason. It was sort of something they had to do.
I mean, I think fans were always going to have somewhat of an unrealistic expectations for him just because of that trade and the amount of first round picks they gave up. But, for one, none of those picks are going to be lottery for almost certainly. Obviously, the Nets' 5 picks weren't from the Nets' 5 first-round picks this year weren't all from the Knicks, but they made 5 first-round picks, and we're seeing them maybe not get crucified, but no one's really thrilled with them. So with what they did with those 5 picks, so the Nets aren't really showing that they're going to be clear winners with this trade with the way they draft. You know, what they take 3 point guards. I mean, it didn't make much sense to me, but that's another story for another day. Yeah, he really I mean, I live in New Jersey, so obviously I see a bunch of Nets games. I knew he wasn't going to be that 24 point a night scorer he was with the Nets, where he was the first option or 1B along with Cam Thomas in the 2023-24 season. But yeah, I mean, at best he was going to be the third option. You knew after they traded for Towns that he wasn't going to get more touches than Brunson. He wasn't going to get more touches than Towns. So, yes, you look at the trade and think, all right, this should be a 25 point a night scorer, but how is he going to be that when you got Brunson, Towns, and you can't just ignore OG? So, really option 3A, OG option 3B, you couldn't ask for much more than his 16, 17 points per game. Now, I will say that the averages weren't great because of the amount he played. So, he was amongst the league leaders in minutes, and 3.2 rebounds, 3.7 assists. Not great. Um, so, but it was still a 50% shooting year. I've heard people say that he really struggled from three. Where he struggled was from the top of the arc, because from the corners he was a flamethrower. So yeah, that top of the arc, and struggled all year other than that Portland game winner. That was a top of the arc shot. But yeah, otherwise, that mid-range was just so pure all season long. Again, I've seen a lot of Nets, but I didn't realize how comfortable that shot would become for him. So many off balance turnaround shots, and he's draining them. I think people saw what he did on Christmas against the Spurs, thought there should be more games like that. That was unrealistic as well. So yeah, I again think he was given too much responsibility on the defensive end when it wasn't quite that necessary when they also had OG on the team. So again, he won't be that point of attack defender as frequently as he was last season in my eyes. Give him a little less defensive responsibility when you have an OG on your team as well. And, I think that might help him on the offensive end. So, yeah, all in all, I don't think it was a terrible extension. I do think the Knicks kind of backed themselves in a corner where it kind of needed to be done, because, what would the optics be like if you trade all them first round picks and then let them walk after 2 seasons? But yeah, it was a minor win to get him to take a little more than the max. It wasn't substantially less than the max, $6 million total. But yeah, as the salary cap continues to go up, he's not. I mean, would I rather have him at his salary or Devin Booker at 70 million? I would probably take Bridges, to be honest, when we compare the salaries. So yeah, it wasn't an extreme overpay. He's getting paid less than OG, and everyone said OG got overpaid last year. It's just the going rate. I mean, Bridges making what, slightly more than Emmanuel Quickly, slightly more than RJ Barrett, and I'd rather have Bridges than those two guys. So yeah, I mean, maybe I expected a little bit more, but I also didn't expect him to have that much of a role on defense where he's always guarding the guy handling the ball. So I think that'll be lessened off his plate this season.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think just in general, this is sort of the price you have to pay, both from a contract standpoint and then a trade standpoint if you're trading for these guys. It's really the price you have to play for elite complementary players in the modern NBA. You look at just a couple of other examples, whether it be the Rudy Gobert trade, which was also criticized for how many picks they gave up, but at the same time, a lot of those picks, sort of like the Bridges trade, didn't end up being the best value. I mean, I would assume that's going to be what we look at a few years down the road with the Bridges trade, just because of how well positioned the Knicks are as a team. Then you look at even dating back 6 years ago or so, the Drew Holiday trade to the Milwaukee Bucks that ended up winning them a championship. They gave up a slew of first round picks to get him, but ultimately it's worth it. They were able to win a championship. For the Knicks, I think it's worth it just because you're able to go to the conference finals and now you position yourself as a legit contender. And I don't know if you're there without Bridges personally. And then similar things can be said for the Rudy Gobert trade. We've seen the Timberwolves go to back-to-back conference finals. Another example we saw this offseason was Desmond Bane to the Magic. The Magic gave up a lot of first-round picks to get him. He could be that real needle mover for the Magic's contention chances. So I just think this is the price you have to pay for guys that are elite complementary players, and I think Bridges is a real essential part of this Knicks squad, and I'm expecting another really high-level season from him. I know there was parts to his season that weren't great, but overall I thought his production was really solid. And then sort of like you talked about with Bridges, you hinted at this with OG as well. Do you see OG's role changing at all just based off the coaching change and then some of the roster changes that they made?
Yeah, I think he could be a more consistent offensive guy. You know, I remember there was some stat I saw last season where the record's incredible when he's attempting at least 15 shots a night. And, there was just too many games where he was invisible in the offense. I just like to see that attacking OG because he was doing it so much when Brunson was out of the lineup. And, obviously things got to change a bit when Brunson's out there, but they shouldn't change that much where OG's just a guy standing in the corner. So, yeah, I think he should be a guy attempting at least 13 to 15 shots a night. And also, again, maybe having a little bit more of a role on that lead ball handler, giving Bridges a break in that sense. So, yeah, I do see him getting a little bit more of a role. And
I completely agree with the OG point there. I could see him getting a little bit more involved in the offense and sort of like you said, taking on more defensive responsibilities. I do feel like, with all due respect to Mikal, I think he's a better defensive player and a little bit better overall. But yeah, sort of wrapping it up here, the Knicks over-under is set to 53.5, which is a pretty big number. They're second behind the Cavs in the East, and then a little bit ahead of the Magic. So where do you see them going from an over-under standpoint and stacking up in the
that's
East?
super hard. 51 wins last year. 51? Yeah, 51 wins last year, 50 the year before that. So slight improvement would be needed, at least from the win column from the get there. Obviously, going 10 against the Thunder, Cavs, and Celtics last season hurt them in that sense. We know that's not going to happen. Well, I can't say we know it's not going to happen, but it would be surprising if they got swept by the Celtics without Jason Tatum. So in that sense, because I don't see him going 0-10 against those three teams, let's say they even go 4-6, 3-7, I think just showing that improvement, especially against those three teams, should get him to reach the over.
Yeah, most definitely. I think, like you said, they won 51 games last year. With the Celtics going to be taking a big step back in the standings, I think that opens up a big opportunity for the Knicks to be that clear-cut number 2 seed. I do think the Cavs, at least regular season-wise, definitely wouldn't say playoff-wise, are ahead of the Knicks in the standings still. But at the same time, there's a lot of open wins in this Eastern Conference, and I see the Knicks being a 55, the 58 win team even. I think the ceiling for them is very high, and I don't know if you're going to say it, but for me, this is my pick to come out of the East right now. I look at the Cavs, and I'm a little bit concerned just based off their last few playoffs, and I don't know if you can win with the combination of two really non-floor spacing bigs. Mobley's taking some strides in that area, and then two smaller guards. I don't know if that's going to bode well for their playoff success, and then the Magic, I think it's just a step too far to say that they're going to come out of the East. So I would say that the Knicks are the team, playoff wise especially, have the most confidence.
Yeah, I'm not shaking my head because I don't think they could do it. It's just something I don't want to say. I've just seen too many Knicks teams that haven't been able to finish the job. I mean, I really didn't get to see much of the Ewing era, but, even back then, those teams weren't able to completely finish the job. Melo, 2012, man, I love that team. Roy Hibbert destroyed him in the second round against the Defensive Player of the Year, Tyson Chandler, that year. So, yeah, there's just been a lot of heartbreak, so I don't want to ever say that. But I do agree with you that Cleveland, they just haven't been that playoff team. Orlando to take a step from not winning a playoff series to all of a sudden reaching the finals. Likewise for the Hawks, not even reaching the playoffs. And otherwise, who else? Philadelphia, that to me, that's laughable. We're already hearing that the Sixers are really concerned about Embiid's knees. So I see why you're saying that. I'm just going to say that.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll be the one to say it. I know you kind of can as a Knicks fan, but yeah. Anyway, Kenny, I appreciate you hopping on the podcast and take care,
All
man.
right, you too. Dunking with Wolves. Check it out, everyone.
Yes, sir.
Later.
Take care.